I think it's important to understand that the exchange's role in the ecosystem of markets. If you look to equities, I think everybody understands the role of the equities markets in allowing investments to happen in companies and assuring that companies get investors with the benefits of transparency, equal treatment, etc. The same, to a large extent, also applies to commodities and the electricity market as well.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm John Feddersen, founder and CEO of Aurora. And today we'll be talking about a vital part of the plumbing of traded power markets, power exchanges specifically. To discuss this topic, my guest today is the head of Nasdaq Commodities, which runs one of Europe's largest power exchanges. Prior to this role, he built up deep experience in the economics of power exchanges. For example, a previous role was head of marketplace at Nodal. My guest on the show is Georg Aasen. Georg, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, John. A pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you here. Can I start just a broad question, something that's on my mind, slightly unrelated to your day job, I suppose, but presumably you've met a bunch of power traders in your time. What do you think are the key characteristics of a successful power trader? And so that's sort of a broad question. And then I suppose a follow-up is, how much of success as a trader over the long term do you think is luck, and how much do you think is skill?
Ooh, tough opening question, but these markets that we operate in, they're very fundamental based in general. And I'll be honest, I've seen a lot of more opportunistic traders entering the market. They might have some success in certain years, etc. But the ones I see staying long and still being here are the ones who really understand the physics. And I think that's essential for long-term performance, I would say.
Yeah, interesting. And do you think, just one follow-up on that, do you think over the long run, it's advantageous to own assets as a trader in power markets, or can you equally succeed just being a trader and not having that vertical integration?
Well, I think that really has to do with knowledge and your ability to acquire information about the fundamentals in the market. So I don't think it's necessary to be in a utility, for instance, to succeed in these markets. I think where it helps is assuring that you get information to you. I'm not talking about insider information here, just general market information, which is obviously an important part of a utility's planning, etc. So as long as you can get that information, and it is available, I would say, to all participants in general, then I think you can be well equipped, not being part of a fundamental player.
Just a couple of, and because the audience of this podcast aren't necessarily all experts on power exchanges, just a couple of basic questions on power exchanges before we get into some more, I suppose, more detailed, more philosophical ones. Can you give a sense of what proportion of power, say in Nodal or in Europe, are traded on exchanges rather than via bilateral contracts or within vertically integrated utilities?
Well, it varies a lot, to be honest, in which markets you operate. Now, Nasdaq Commodities is primarily known for its Nordic position, and that's where we come from historically as well. So if you look to the Nordic market design, this is really established it's getting close to 30 years now when it started off. And the regulators at that point of time identified that they wanted to see a derivatives market on top. So they created the market structure by where it was recognized as a good solution for the market. So the Nordic market is to a large extent traded on the exchange and cleared today. If I should give a number, I don't have the exact numbers because that is not available, what is actually traded fully in the bilateral market. But I would say it probably lies in the range 80% cleared, 20% bilateral.
And is the share growing, do you think? Or is it reasonably constant over the last, say, 10 years?
Well, in the Nordics, we've actually seen a trend to a little bit more bilateral market, and I think that's unique to the Nordics, coming from close to 95 or even 100% 2 decades back. But the reason for that lies very much in the specifics in the Nordic market design, where we do have the concept of a common system price for the whole Nordic, which functions as a proxy for the Nordic region. It's thereby not an actual physical price, whilst we also have the 12 individual price areas in the Nordic. So due to many price areas in the Nordics and bigger price differentials between the respective areas, as we especially see nowadays, with a big price difference between North and South, in Norway and Sweden in particular, this has resulted in it becoming increasingly difficult for us within the regulated framework to create liquid so-called EPAs, which is the contracts we use for the specific price areas. So that's been pulling the market a little bit more bilateral, together, I would say, with financial regulation. Financial regulation has, in general, not helped the Nordic market push into more regulated. It's actually, to a large extent, done the opposite, due to costs on clearing, with the EMIR being essential for what you can use as collateral. And also, when it comes to MiFID, requiring a lot more on participants trading in the regulated framework. Okay. So it's a complex picture.
Interesting. Okay, and I note, I think that is a very high share, at least that sounds like a very high share of traded power compared to, say, the GB market or continental markets, where I think it tends to be, almost flipped around the other way, or even more so, sort of single digit or teens being traded in power markets.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you see to continental Europe and the UK, it was the reverse. It was built up in the physical delivered market and not derivatives, and so it's more a conversion to more, especially in continental Europe with Germany, etc. It's the cleared share has increased during the last 2 decades, and I think today it's approximately 50% cleared and 50% bilateral in the German market, as an example.
Interesting. Just to dig a little bit deeper, so you said there's 2 reasons why traded volumes are declining in the Nordic region. One was around 12 price zones and differentials and declining liquidity. The other was around regulation, increasing the burden for people who want to participate in markets. Could you say a little bit more about the first of those 2? So we know that prices can get very low in northern Norway. There's a number of price zones in that country. What is it? I mean, but presumably we had price differentials in the past. What is it about these greater extremes that makes it, that reduces liquidity? What's reducing the liquidity there?
Yeah, and I think you have to look at the system price as concept on top of the error prices for that, because the system price was originally designed by the energy regulators in Norway and then Sweden, etc., to make a proxy that should capture majority of the price signals to the market. So in order to create a big enough area to create a liquid market foundation on, one ended up with this concept of system price. Now that works very well when there's only small price differentials between the areas. And it was especially relevant for the more hydro-based areas in Norway and parts of Sweden, which always has functioned as an extremely high correlated good proxy for that. So in principle, one would say that it had a pretty natural hedge between the actual area price and the system price. Now, what's happened recently is that the system price has kind of become an in-between price, you can say, especially nowadays, between the low-priced northern parts and the more high-priced southern parts. So it doesn't fulfill a strong role by itself these days when just using the system price as a hedge. So because of that, you really need to dig down and also include the area prices in addition.
Okay, now, got it. So you're in the northern zone. You would use the system-based contract. You'd hedge on the basis of a baseload system contract, and that was good enough for your purpose. It wasn't a perfect hedge, but it was worth the trade-off for the liquidity. Exactly. Now it's not worth the trade-off for the liquidity, and you may just go bilateral. Okay, understood. What can you say a bit about in the Nordics? What percentage of traded volumes are sort of a baseload, or the Americans would call around the clock contract?
Well, looking to the derivatives, pretty much everything is baseload traded, and I think the core reason for that is we've been pretty much a base load system fundamentally, especially related to, if you look to the Nordic and the like Norway, 95% or so comes from hydro, and hydro is very easy to balance. So base load is a very good hedging tool for hydro production in particular. And obviously the same with nuclear, etc. as well, which is one tends to define as baseload production.
So I'd like to pick up on the future, and I'd like to spend quite a lot of time in terms of sort of where you see things going. Before we do that, just one other question on a philosophical question on the social contribution of markets. And I suppose potentially there's kind of two ways of asking this question. One is, what's your favorite example of innovation because of traded markets or in traded markets that benefits society? I suppose another way of asking that question is, what would the European power market look like in the absence of power exchanges? Would it be worth? Do you have reflections on the social contribution of markets as someone who's dedicated your career to the furthering them?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to understand that the exchange's role in the ecosystem of markets. I mean, I think we should relate it. If you look to equities, I think everybody understands the role of the equities markets in allowing investments to happen in companies and assuring that companies gets investors with the benefits of transparency, equal treatment, etc. So the same, to a large extent, also applies to commodities and the electricity market as well. Our fundamental players, they're in this for the long run, obviously. A typical investment will probably take 20 years plus to pay down. It's a huge investment to build a new power plant. And what we offer is strong price signals. We offer liquidity, transparency, and assuring that, the more trust you can have about the future development of a price and your ability to hedge off certain parts of that price risk when you're investing is fundamentally important to allow companies to invest in new installations, etc. So, and in the end of the day, how do you, if you look on a balance sheet of a utility, for instance, they're very much dependent on showing that they have a long-term income as well. And what's the best way to secure that is by hedging, strengthening their balance sheet, allowing them to reinvest.
So looking to the future, first of all, what do you think the biggest innovation in power exchanges, power trading has been over the last decade? What's something where you look back 10 years ago and you say, wow, that really had an impact?
Well, obviously, if you look to exchanges in general, the development in the more physical exchanges has been the highest development when you're moving closer to delivery, the ability to offer, going from 1 hour down to 30 minutes, 50 minutes, 5 minutes, etc., is probably the biggest development you've seen on the market size in general. Now, that said, there's going to be a lot of development going into the future on the exchanges as well. And by that, I'm really thinking about the green transition and the importance of electricity in that transition. There's going to be a lot of need for new products, developments, etc., that is more compatible with renewables. We're talking about hydrogen potentially, or coming in eventually, market as guarantees of origin, etc. But all these markets are pretty much into the development stage now. And I think it's important to realize that these markets tends to be built in the bilateral segment and kind of build up a certain level of maturity and liquidity before it's ready to move on to an exchange as we represent. So it's often very difficult to start off innovation on the regulated markets. But the regulated markets helps when it comes to a certain level of security. Regulated markets helps take it to the next level and assure that you get the right products in, you get the right investors into the market, and take it onwards.
Excellent. So that's a really good segue, and I'd like to dig a bit deeper on a number of those topics. You talked about power contracts, renewables, offtake, PPAs, and also you talked about non-power contracts like guarantees of origin and hydrogen. If I could start with the PPAs, the renewables offtake, I suppose my kind of recollection of history up until now is, as you say, these have tended to be bespoke and bilateral. You typically, at least in Europe, you would have a contract with a utility, an offtake, a utility PPA type thing, where you would agree the terms of a contract to sell your wind power or your solar power from your asset. Or I suppose increasingly over the last few years, you'd cut out the utility and you deal directly with an end consumer, someone who has a motive for that, like an Apple or an Amazon or a Deutsche Bahn or someone like that who has a hedging motive, but probably also a social motive. We're also starting to see in this space platforms. So in Europe, level 10, Pexa Park, who, the sort of marketing, as far as I understand, sort of marketing contracts from both buyers and sellers, and trying to match them, but typically then bespoke contracts ensue. What do you see as the end game here? Is it, and particularly around those sort of platforms? Are those platforms your future competitors? Do you acquire them? Are they naturally acquired by the exchanges? Do they coexist? And is there an exchange traded very generic product next to a sort of matching service for bespoke products? Could you say a bit about, I suppose, the evolution of of renewables offtake and the evolution of the market structure around matching buyers and sellers?
I think talking about the evolution there, I think it's very natural, and the way a market natural is built up will always be that it starts in the bilateral, it settles there, it matures in concept and in formation as well, because very often in early days, it's pretty much business to business deals which are being done. And we see that to a large extent these days as well. When you mentioned about the social motive where Google and Apple and these are integrated, they are looking for a very specific type of investment. So it's not something that you can just go and pick off a shelf. It needs to be tailored specifically. So in that maturity phase, I think it's impossible for a regulated exchange to create the right product. But as markets evolves and becomes more standardized, that's when the exchanges come in and play a significant role in building further market liquidity and in giving the right investment signals.
Why, I suppose a follow-up on that then would be, if right now it's about the bilateral contracts, why doesn't a regional wind index or a solar index, you could go out there and you could say, look, I know it's not necessarily your geographic scope, but you could say, look, we're going to have a solar index in Spain, right? We've got all the weather data, we know when it produces, so we're going to have that profile. And for the most part with solar, over a period of a few weeks, you sort of the output broadly matches what history has suggested. The sun comes up at the same time every day. Why isn't that enough right now? And why don't we see any of those?
Well, I can relate to what we've done here at Nasdaq. Some years back, we did create a German wind index in collaboration with very many market participants to get the design right, etc. The index has been a good success story. It's very well respected among market participants. It's very often used as a proxy or underlying for bilateral transactions, etc. But the level of maturity isn't there yet to get any traction on the exchange. So that just shows the maturity phase that I'm talking about of the market development. It takes time for a market to start adapting to new products, especially in the regulated framework, and having to post collateral, dealing with liquidity risk potentially, etc., makes it so much easier to structure those deals in a more business-to-business facility, which the bilateral often represents in early phases. So I think it's just the whole market concept and the way it's a natural development. Okay,
so it sounds like you think there'll be more of this, and more renewables in the market, more knowledge and market experience. So we're on the journey. It's not like it's
absolutely, and there's no question that these markets will develop, and some of them will become or be ready to trade it on regulated markets, but they need to come to that maturity level and liquidity level before it's the right timing to list them on exchanges. And an example is the GO market. If you look to the GO market in electricity today, there's probably 150 different varieties of that contract. It's based on what underlying production it is. Is it hydro? Is it wind? Solar, etc. What's the location of it? Which region in individual countries are they in? What's the maturity of that specific installation, etc. And talking about social motives as Google and the ones more from an ESG perspective looking into those deals, they're targeting very specific installations and requirements for PPAs and GEOs. So that just shows the complexity. And for a derivatives exchange as us, listing potentially 150 different varieties of GEOs for the electricity market is not functional. It's not feasible for us to do that. We needed much more standardized before we can take on such markets.
Interesting. Is there, and this may be beyond your area of expertise, but there've been a lot more PPAs signed in the US than in Europe. To me, the major driver of that is the tax equity structure. Basically, federal government support for renewables is predominantly through investment production tax credits, which mean that there's a part of the capital structure for someone who may want to offtake power. Has that standardization in the US helped with kind of exchange traded, power from renewables, PPAs?
I think that has given the right incentives for investors to rely on the price signals, if you can call it, and giving them trustability in that segment. So yes, I would say so.
So we've talked about renewables offtake, PPAs. We've talked about guarantees of origin. You mentioned hydrogen briefly before. Where are we with hydrogen? Are there any hydrogen contracts out there on exchanges at the moment? Irrespective of whether it's green or blue or grey or whatever it is. Do any of these exist? And yeah, what do we need to? Government's focusing at the moment on production of hydrogen, and thinking a bit about consumption. But I think far more on production and green hydrogen, electrolyzers, and those types of things. Are there any sort of concrete steps you see towards, tradable hydrogen of different colors on exchanges?
We'll get there. That will be an important part of the green transition in total. When we talk about long-term targets by 2050, even though it's a long way ahead of us right now, one does estimate that the hydrogen will probably represent approx 10% plus of the electricity market in the future. But that it takes time, and as you're saying, we're at very early phases in development of hydrogen. It's a lot of talk about it. It's a lot of capital being invested in it. We see also politicians certainly identifying hydrogen as part of the green transition. So it's going to get there. But before we start talking about potentially trading them on regulated markets, it needs to come to a much higher level. I mean, you need to have a significant production from hydrogen before it becomes relevant for trading on exchanges. What we do see in the bilateral segment is that certain are looking to develop indices. We were talking about hydrogen GEOs already now. So it's starting to develop in this early phases, but it's going to take time. I don't think anybody really knows what a hydrogen contract would look like in the future right now. And I think it's important to also recognize what politicians, political decisions made in market design also plays in there. It really depends on what kind of incentives will they give to the market for building out hydrogen. Is it going to be equivalent to what we've seen in renewables with subsidy schemes, or what's it going to look like? So I think that's to be seen.
Yeah, and I think one of the parallels is this GEO type thing. How do you know whether the power has come from a renewable asset or something else? And I think we see we see a similar situation with hydrogen, where a lot of European funding is tied to greenness or being below a certain carbon intensity, which is hard to prove. If you're grid connected, it's quite hard to prove. And so I think we're seeing, and we're doing a lot of work in this space with clients, electrolyzers going off grid because they want to be able to demonstrate that all their power is coming from green sources in order to get government support. Whether that's the right way to structure a system, I think is another question. I suspect it's not, but we're going to have that whole GOO problem and issue, market liquidity and how to define product categories all over again in hydrogen. It's not. It doesn't seem to me as simple as if you can have a natural gas market in Europe and liquid traded natural gas markets, you can do the same for hydrogen, because I think there's that environmental complication there.
It certainly is. But hydrogen will play a very important role, I believe, in the energy markets in the future. And just using hydrogen as a storage facility for more long term is probably where we'll see the best benefit of hydrogen in the energy sector overall.
Mm-hmm. Now, we've touched on government intervention in a number of areas, and I think you've often talked about, be careful, government, if you partition the market into too many pieces, or if you change the requirements of greenness on different products, you can carve the GOO market up, you're going to have problems with creating liquid markets. One thing I hear a bit, or I've heard over the years, is the point at which we introduced the EU ETS, the emissions trading scheme in Europe, was the point at which people could no longer make long-term market-oriented power investment decisions. So, you could, before the EU ETS, before 2005, you could buy a gas power station and you were taking a bet on the gas price. After the EU ETS, you were also taking a bet on a long-term policy variable that could change at the whims of Brussels or Berlin or London or any of those things. Do you think the EU ETS and the introduction of it undermined liquidity in wholesale power markets?
Yeah, I would say so. And I mean, the concept of the EU ETS was very clear. And I think it was, it certainly fits the purpose. What the problem was, when you look at the volatility and the price signals, etc., it was a lot of, and the information handling, especially, I would point out, made it very uncertain of what the development of the market would look like in terms of pricing, especially. The prices went up to 30 and then bounced down to 0. It was a poor market design in terms of pricing, and that uncertainty that created to the whole market back in especially 2006, I believe it was, when it collapsed, was very unfortunate for the market overall.
Good. Now, it's probably a good time to move us towards a conclusion. But before I do that, we have a segment where I called Overrated, Underrated, where I present a few concepts in the energy transition and ask you whether you think they're overrated or underrated. Now, I suppose the concept's a bit like trading in markets. You don't get rewarded for investing in something that's good or bad. You get rewarded for investing in something that's underrated or overrated relative to where it should be. So hopefully it's a segment that's close to your heart as someone who runs an exchange. But the first concept is the role of power markets, rather than sort of regulated monopolies, in driving decarbonisation. Do you think the role of traded power markets in driving decarbonisation is overrated or underrated?
Yeah, underrated.
Does that mean, just to follow up on that, does that mean that in parts of the US, many other parts of the world where you have these regulated monopolies, you think we'll move towards more traded markets? Like, do you think the march is towards markets over the coming decades?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, if we're talking about this green transition that we're going into, you need a well-functioning power market and also power exchanges with the financial segment of the market to make it happen. That's going to help investors choose the right investments and give more certainty than elsewhere for long-term investments.
Okay, great. So second question, we touched on this before, the role of PPA platforms is sort of to match buyers and sellers as intermediaries within power markets. Do you think their role is overrated or underrated?
Underrated as well, because in many ways they help the transition, and again it's about transparency and allowing for information to give the right investment signals.
Great. And then the final concept is the future extent of nodal pricing in Europe. And by nodal, I mean more like the US version of sort of thousands of nodes in a market. Do you think the future extent of nodal pricing in Europe is overrated or underrated?
Well, to answer that, if you look to Norway and Sweden now, in Norway we have 5 price areas. In Sweden there's 4 price areas. We are struggling to create a liquid market with 5 price areas in Norway. I mean, these individual price zones, it's extremely challenging to build a solid liquid market on these areas. Now, and I think that's fundamentally important in the market design, that you also not just look at the physical power flow in market design and for investment purposes, but that you also identify what's needed in terms of creating a well-functioning hedging market on top of that, end user market. And to me, it's essential that you do not go into that thinking that nodal prices will help the future needs of investments in the market, because it's going to be much more challenging to perform long-term hedging with many nodes.
Interesting. It's a really good take. I mean, it's sort of, so we had Peter Crampton on the show. He's an economist. He'd been a director at ERCOT and among other roles. He's very pro nodal pricing. I think he comes at it as looking at the physical system. This is more efficient if we're settling imbalance through the system operator rather than through an algorithm at the nodal level. That's inefficient. But the counter here that we're hearing is illiquid hedging markets and imperfect, incomplete financial markets also have a big social cost. So there's a balance to be struck. That's very interesting. And it's probably a natural note to finish on. So thanks so much for taking the time today to talk about what I think is a vital and sometimes neglected part of the power system infrastructure. So Georg Aasen, thanks so much for taking the time to speak.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was John Feddersen, founder and CEO of Aurora, speaking to Georg Aasen, head of Nasdaq Commodities. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening and goodbye.